Yeah.
Maybe answering a lot of questions. This is like, I don't know. But offense is when you attack another person's case.
Okay.
I guess.
You can theoretically attack another person's case with defense as well. Can we get maybe a more specific definition? Yeah.
You get more grounds from the offense, like you turn an argument so that like creates more ground for you, which creates more offense.
So I don't know if that's true. Ground has to do with the availability of the arguments that you have to use. So your ground encompasses the turns that you can make or the offense that you can generate. What does offense do for you? Yes?
It gives you something to win on.
Okay, so it gives you something to win on. Why can you win on offensive arguments as opposed to defensive arguments? So what is a defensive argument then, I'll ask? Yeah.
You're defending your case, or you're, well, I mean.
So you can make defensive arguments on your opponent's case.
When you support your own argument, maybe? Okay, yeah, this is not what
Okay, so defensive arguments are arguments about why your opponent is not right. But they don't necessarily mean that you're right? Offensive arguments are arguments that not just prove that your opponent is wrong, but that you are right. Okay? Who watches basketball? Does anybody watch basketball in here? NBA? So famous saying that it's offense, not defense. That it's defense that it's defense, not offense, that wins championships in the NBA. Right? It's the exact opposite in debate. Offense will always win you debates. And so, if you can take a more offensive route to explain more reasons, not just why your opponent is wrong, but why you are right, then you're going to win more debates. The question then is, why don't debaters generate enough offense? My first subpoint here is that debaters are lazy, oftentimes. They haven't read enough on the topic, so they don't know what the major link and internal link arguments are. What I mean by that is they don't understand the nuances of link chains that happen in affirmative cases, of disadvantages on the topic, of counterplans on the topic. They haven't read enough literature. So they instead rely on making analytical arguments that are mostly defensive in nature. Even if it's not analytical arguments, you can still generate turns analytically, but the more that you know about the topic, the easier it's going to become to generate those turns, right? Because if you don't know what the positions are, if you don't know what the literature says, it's going to be hard for you to think about how to generate offense on a position off the top of your head. But if you've done a lot of literature reading, you have a lot of background knowledge on what the topic says, then you're going to have a much better chance of generating offense. It's going to be a lot easier for you to generate offense both analytically and with evidence, because seemingly if you've read a lot of literature, you've also cut a lot of cards. Also, debaters have not thought about what arguments are weakest on the topic, which means that they haven't actually taken the time to think about where should I cut cards, what kind of cards should I cut, what kind of answers should I be thinking about making against some of these arguments, some of the weakest arguments on the topic as well. And also they try to apply the same arguments to everything. How often have you been, or I guess, are any of y'all from the novice lab? So, or I guess, do any of you not have any debate experience? Okay, so how many times have you been in a round and the person just starts setting off blips on the argument? There's no warrant, no warrant, no warrant, non-unique, non-unique, right? But they've never tried to explain any of these arguments. They just label them as solvency deficits, no warrants, non-unique, whatever, right? They try to apply the same arguments to everything without actually attempting to think critically about the argument to generate an offensive response, right? Oftentimes the response falls too short. Instead of saying, they don't do X, instead of saying, like, they don't, so say the AF says handgun bans decrease violence, oftentimes debaters will stop short at, no, they don't decrease violence, and then stop, right? When the best answer is, no, they increase violence, right? And you see the difference between those. One is defensive. One says that they don't decrease violence. And the other one says, no, they have increased violence. right? That's the fundamental difference between offense and defense, and oftentimes debaters will stop at nah. They just don't decrease violence. But that's not enough, right? That's not a winning argument. A winning argument is a term that says they increase violence. So don't try to apply the same, they don't do this, it's not unique, there's no warrant for this, but try to take it a step further to explain why it's actually an argument for your side. So the next point here is that debaters are afraid to commit. What I mean by that is debaters know that developing an offensive argument requires significant time investment, and that investment trades off with making more arguments. Everybody knows how in debate now people tend to like to make a larger quantity of arguments over quality of arguments. But to generate good offensive arguments, that just can't be the case, right? And debaters are afraid to committing to only reading 4 or 5 cards on the app that are really, really good and have multiple in-depth warrants, right? Because they would rather make a lot of blippy, smaller defensive arguments, right? But it's always going to be better to generate offense, arguments that you can win off of, that are well developed and well warranted, because those are going to be hard to respond to, and you can win off them, because you're not going to be able to win off of a bunch of defensive flips. Let's see. Oh, also they're afraid to debate on the few big, well-developed issues, because they prefer to hide in the shadows of tricks and theory and things to camouflage the potential offensive arguments. But instead, you should focus on what can I do to generate more offense and what can I do to generate a win, as opposed to attempting to either dodge the discussion or minimize it by just putting little defensive answers on it. You should instead try to focus on how can I generate offense on this argument, as opposed to hiding in the shadows of some kind of crutch like theory or blippy defensive arguments. The next point here is that debaters don't generate offense because they use their framework as a crutch. Oftentimes debaters will get so caught up in going down the flow or maintaining their framework, or if they're a heavy framework debater, they just avoid the contention level discussion altogether to try to win framework and win off their case. Again, this isn't super strategic either, because then if you lose the framework debate, you have nothing else to fall back on, right? You always want to be trying to generate turns and offensive arguments against your opponent's contention level, because otherwise, if you focus too much on the framework, then you're not going to have anything to fall back to in the instance that your opponent does end up winning the framework debate. Let's see. And the last reason I'll have here is that debaters don't fully understand what makes an argument offensive. Offense is not just a proactive reason to vote for you, but instead proactive means controlling a situation by causing something to happen rather than responding to it to happen. Reactive means showing a response to a stimulus, but these words are meaningless in the context of offense and defense. Offense is a reason why your advocacy is better than your opponent's advocacy. And this is the best explanation that I can possibly give, because it adds a comparative aspect to it, right? So going back to the original example, it's not just saying they don't decrease violence, and it's also not just they increase violence, but you need to take it a step further to compare the specific advocacies. Why is it that their advocacy increases violence, but your advocacy results in a decrease in violence, right? That comparative difference is what makes the best kind of offense, right? Because you're not only showing why their side causes something bad to happen, but you're also showing why your side causes something good to happen, right? And when you frame your arguments in that light, you're framing the arguments as offensively as you possibly can, because you're displaying not just why your advocacy is better, but why your advocacy is comparatively better in a world where they increase violence, you decrease violence. They crash relations with China, you increase relations with China, right? Comparison is key, highlight the relevant comparison. So that comparison can be the AC world versus the status quo, or if the negative reads a counterplan, the AC world versus the world of the counterplan, right? If the negative reads a critique, it can be the world of the AC versus the critique alternative, right? But those comparisons need to exist, and you need to be making those comparisons when generating your offensive arguments. Okay, so the second Roman numeral here, that was why debaters don't generate offense, to get you thinking about some of your own practices and why you don't generate enough offense in your rounds. The second numeral here is the problems with not generating offense, why it's bad. And I won't spend too much time here because it should be pretty obvious at this point that generating offense is key to winning these debate rounds. Failure to generate offense means that you're not going to have enough to fall back on your rebuttals for the judge to vote on. But the A sub-point here is that the first problem with not generating enough offense is that you get repetitive because you have to rely on constant cross-applications of your case. And I see this really, really, really frequently with younger debaters in particular, like debaters in their first 2 years. Their refutation ends up lacking diversity because every argument is just a cross-application of an argument from your AC. It is good to have an app that you can fall back on, that is strong, that is comparative, that you can use to weigh against NCs, but it should not be an excuse for not addressing the line by line of your opponent's case with unique arguments that were not made in your 1AC. Why do you think it is important to have a diverse layers of refutation as opposed to just relying on your AC? Yeah?
If you have more arguments, you'll have more things to fall onto if you're using an argument.
Okay, that's true. So it advantages you in that way. And how does it advantage your opponent if you do that?
They have to respond to more.
Well, how does it advantage your opponent if you just rely on cross applications from your case? What is grouping? Have you heard that term, grouping arguments? What is, I see you nodding your head, what does it mean to group arguments?
Like say they make 3 attacks when there's contingent 1 and they each have like a separate reason, and then you'll just group them all together and say each of them doesn't have one.
Yeah, so if their entire refutation strategy is based on cross applications of 2 or 3 cards from the AC, what does that allow them to do? Group all those cross applications, right? You can group every time they make a cross application, make 1 or 2 arguments against that, and you're done, right? It makes it really easy for your opponent because it limits the amount of arguments that they have to answer. So if your refutation lacks diversity, it makes it easier for your opponent to group arguments and destroy you in the next speech. You said you don't leave multiple outs for the last rebuttal. This is also true. And your opponent can kick out of more arguments since doing so does not represent a harmful concession, right? If you're not generating enough turns, this is another important point. If you're generating turns on an argument, can your opponent just be like, nah, this doesn't matter. Bye. I see you shaking your head, why not?
Because the turn is offensive.
Right, the turn is offensive, so you can stand up in the next speech and be like, you just conceded some turns. Like, these are reasons to vote for me. You can't just do that, right? What if there's just defense on an argument? Can the opponent kick it?
Yeah.
Yeah, right, because they've got nothing to lose at that point. So generating offense on arguments forces your opponent to engage on a different, on that argument, on that contention, on a different layer. It forces them to invest their time on that argument in the rebuttal, whereas a defensive heavy strategy leaves your opponent with the opportunity to just kick out of certain arguments that they don't feel like going for, and going for arguments that have less coverage of them. Okay? Yeah, I mean, those basically encompass the main reasons why not generating offense is bad. You also tend to get spread out in these debates where you don't have an offensive heavy strategy. When you're AF, you have to generate offense on the negative case so that the NR can't kick the NC and spend 6 minutes destroying the AC, right? You need to generate offense on the NC so that they have to engage on that level of the debate, right? Like we were talking about. If you just, like, let's say the NC is able to generate a lot of turns against your AF case, but then in the 1AR, you just go and defend your AF case, but only put defensive responses on the NC. that gives the opportunity for a time trade-off advantage to the negative. Because then they can stand up for a 6-minute NR and say, they haven't turned the NC, forget it, kick it, cross it off the flow, put it aside, I'm going to win off all the turns that I made on the AC. And then the time advantage is shifted in their favor because then they have 6 minutes in the NR to win whatever turns that you've done whatever job answering in the 1 AR, right? So generating offense on multiple layers of the debate so that they don't get the opportunity to kick out of certain arguments to shift the time advantage in their favor. Okay, so now we'll get into where we gotta go. How to generate offense. So first point here is general tips. First, you must understand the intricacies of the link chain. What do I mean by link chain? Okay, so a link chain, no markers. That's upsetting. So if I had markers, what I would do is I would draw a series of links on the board here, right? These links would represent the steps that occur from the initial argument leading to a terminal impact. So an example of this would be a disadvantage, a disad. How many of you have talked about disads in lab yet? Okay, so if you've talked about disad, what is a link, an internal link, and an impact?
Okay, so the link is to the resolution, like if when the affirmative affirms the resolution, like the specific link that happens to an impact, and it has to show that it's the brink evidence that it's going to go over with the affirmation of the resolution.
Okay, yeah, so the link part of a disadvantage is specifically about what it is that the resolution or the affirmative advocacy does that is going to change something from the status quo and start a cascade. It's going to start this link chain. It's going to start a cascade down to a terminal impact, right? Think of it like a chain of dominoes, so to speak. And the link is that tap on the first domino that's going to cause them to start falling. The terminal impact is the domino hitting something that causes the golf ball to fly up in the air off the spoon or something like that, right? So the way that this is relevant to generating offense is not a disad lecture, but the point is you should understand the intricacies of that link chain, right? Because each part of that link chain is potential as a place that you could potentially turn, right? So let's say the disad was on this topic. The link is banning handguns will banning handguns will cause relations between U.S. and Canada to collapse. And U.S.-Canadian relations are key to signing the next big environmental treaty. And that environmental treaty is key to slowing the tide of global warming, and global warming is going to cause the polar ice caps to melt, and we're all going to drown and cause extinction, right? That's the link chain. But each of those different links has the potential to be turned, right? The first link you can say, no, banning handguns doesn't decrease U.S.-Canadian relations. Banning handguns actually increases U.S.-Canadian relations, right? Turn it there. The second link, about how U.S.-Canadian relations are key to signing the next big environmental treaty. You can say, they say that the AF will prevent the treaty from being signed. You say that the AF causes the treaty to be signed, right? You can go on and on. You can even turn the global warming argument, and you can say, they say global warming is bad. I say global warming is good. Right? Those are impact turns. That literature exists. People say that global warming is good because it will save us off from the next ice age. I don't know if that's true, but it is an argument, right? The point is understand the intricacies of these link chains and know that where you can generate offense so that you're cognizant of those arguments and you can cut cards that make these arguments. Another strategy that you can take for generating offense is if you do have a lot of turns compared to a particular affirmative case. I see a lot of young debaters in particular too afraid to let it go. But if you've got a lot of offensive answers to the AC, don't be afraid to concede their framework from the get-go, right? A really, really effective strategy that we used all the time when I was debating was we were util debaters. We like to debate policy style, right? So we cut a lot of cards. We ended up having a lot of cards that answered a lot of different apps, right? Our favorite thing was to be able to say, from the start of the 7 minutes of the NC, I concede to the affirmatives framework. I'm just going to generate a ton of offense under their framework, under their criterion. That's what we did. We generate 7 minutes of turns. We do either a straight ref strategy or we would read disadvantages, right? That were all offense against their app, right? Because we didn't want to deal with the framework. So if there's any way that you can possibly concede the affirmative framework to get out of that discussion and then generate 7 minutes of offense, that's great for you. Because is framework, this is a good question, is framework offensive? I see this happen with young debaters a lot as well. Is framework offense? Who said no? Why is it not offense?
Because it doesn't like impact, or it should be accessible by both sides.
I mean, what does it mean to, well, so go back, what does it mean to be offense? It's about showing why your advocacy is better than your opponent's advocacy. Is framework part of your actual resolutional advocacy? No, right? It's a method of evaluating the arguments that you make under your resolutional advocacy, right? It's a filter to determine which arguments are relevant, which arguments matter, right? But it is not your advocacy. Does that make sense to everyone? I see a lot of debaters that will go and extend like their value, extend their criterion, and they'll label it as a voting issue. I will say I think that works for like NSDA or if you're in Texas UIL style sometimes, because back in the day, the value criterion still used to be a voting issue. I think it has evolved since then, where people have come to understand that the framework is not your advocacy in itself. The reason we vote app is because we've shown that a ban on handguns is better than not banning handguns or whatever the alternative is, right? So winning utilitarianism, winning deontology, whatever, is just a method of evaluating what arguments are important. So you don't get any offense off the framework. You can concede it and jump straight to generating offense. That's more arguments that you can make as reasons to vote for you in that speech, and more time that they have to invest answering those arguments. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, next point here is how to make smart turns. So, first point, to turn an argument, you must state the opposite of what your opponent said and argue that what your opponent said is actually support for your side. Pretty obvious, right? Clearly state what type of turn you're making and the specific link, internal link, or impact that you are turning. Also pretty clear, right? But you should make it clear, I am turning this particular link, I am turning this particular card, I'm turning this particular subpoint or contention, right? So the judge knows where to put it on their flow. The more precise you are, the harder it is for your opponent to claim it's non-responsive, and the less likely it will be that you label an argument a turn when it's not a turn. So all I'm trying to say here is be precise in terms of what kind of argument you're making, what kind of turn you're making, how that turn is being applied to whatever argument your opponent is making, right? It is also less likely if you're precise and you think about where you've placed your turns on the flow, it's less likely that you double turn yourself. Does anyone know what a double turn is? Yeah.
It's basically what it was in the beginning. Like, if like the negative says it increases unemployment, and then you turn it, and then like they turn it again, like it's basically the same thing that it was in the beginning.
Not quite. So yeah.
A double turn is like when you make an attack on their link, but like for a dissent, I guess. But then you also make an attack on their impact.
Yeah, exactly. So what does that result in? An argumentative contradiction, right? So what an example of what he just said would be, let's say the disadvantage is, the first link is that banning handguns is going to result in the decline in U.S.-Canadian relations, and the terminal impact as global warming causes extinction, right? So say you turn the link and you say that banning handguns is going to increase U.S.-Canadian relations. And then you turn the impact and you say global warming is good. What have you done? What is then the logical result of that?
You just chop your impact from half.
Well, yeah, so you say that you are causing a bad thing to happen, right? That bad thing being preventing global warming from taking over the world, right? Because you're making the argument when you turn the impact that global warming is good. But when you turn the link, you're essentially saying that global warming is going to be staved off because the AF increases relations with Canada and the treaty is going to get passed then, right? So you need to be careful about where you place your turns to avoid those types of argumentative contradictions. They're both technically offense, but it is offense that contradicts one another. And that makes it really easy for your opponent to win at that point. I've seen a lot of key debates, like semifinals of the Tournament of Champions, right? Like finals of TFA State, right? People lose on double turns because they make a lot of offense, which is good, but they're not smart about how they generate their offense. And they make a double turn, their opponent exploits it, and they end up losing off of it. Does everyone understand what a double turn is? It's really important. Okay? It's also important that you're able to, this is, I guess, another type of generating offense, but it's important that you're also able to recognize when your opponent has double turned themselves. Because there's this has happened to me. It's a terrible feeling when you lose a debate, or even if you win a debate, but it's like close, and then you go back and you look at it later and you realize your opponent double turned themselves. You could have won like that if you had just said something about it. That's a crappy feeling. So know and be cognizant of when your opponent has double turned themselves by just paying smart attention to the flow, thinking about how arguments logically interact with one another when thinking about the arguments that have been made in debate, right? If you're cognizant of that, if you're logically thinking about that argument interaction, you're going to be able to catch your opponent when they double turn themselves. Okay? Okay, next piece of advice for making smart turns. Find the weakest part of their link chain, find the weakest contention, find their weakest subpoint, and make turns with multiple warrants, with deep warrants, and read lots of evidence, right? Aim for the throat, so to speak. Pick out where their weakest part is and go hard on there with the best evidence, with the best turns that you possibly can. Sometimes your opponent will have a case that just doesn't have that strong weak point that you can attack. But most AFs are going to have some kind of weakness of some kind. Whether it's one particular argument that the rest of their arguments hinge on, right? Whether it's just a piece of, just a particular layer of the debate they just don't have good evidence on, and you do have good evidence on, and you can crush them on that layer of the debate in that way, right? Find where their weakest arguments are and generate the deepest, most warrants, the deepest warrants, the most warrants that you possibly can with the best evidence that you possibly can. And again, this ties back to just researching. Cannot emphasize that enough, that the importance of generating good offense, good strong offense, goes hand in hand with extensive research and being able to cut good cards. So make sure that researching, being a good researcher and being able to cut good cards is oftentimes a prerequisite to a lot of skills in debate. And this is no exception. So this is something I will maintain to be true despite what a lot of debaters now tend to think this is untrue. The fast blip, like 50 argument spread may be intimidating, but the smart spread is still absolutely terrifying. And what I mean by the smart spread is that you are conscious of making these less arguments, but still these arguments have more warrants, the best evidence, the deepest warrants. And you can do evidence comparison, you can do the weighing of those impacts, you can compare your advocacies and the way that your advocacies interact with these terms. If you do that level of explanation with your argumentation, that is so much scarier than trying to address like 50 arguments that are basically the same exact thing, I promise. Because there's so many more nuances to those arguments that you can go for in the next speech, that you can articulate as why your opponent's responses don't matter, why they're not responsive, because you have taken the time to nuance your argument, to develop it out to the point to say, yeah, some of these arguments may apply, but they've missed this nuance, and they've missed this detail, and they've missed this particular warrant, and take out the response that they've made, right? But if your arguments are like, 2-sentence long blips, and you may have made a lot of them, but oftentimes those arguments are very, very easy to take out, right? Because they're unwarranted, they're underdeveloped. Okay, so those are my tips for generating smart turns. Let's talk about specific types of turns that you can make now. So the first type of turn is a link turn. A link turn. Anybody have an idea of what a link turn is? Given that some of you have had a discussion of disads, so you kind of know what a link is. Yeah.
It's like you turn the link to their impact against them, so like they can't access their impacts.
Yeah, so not only can they not access their impacts, but then you have now gained access to their impact, right? So a link turn, in other words, says that they're linked to whatever their impact is. So if it's something as simple as a handgun ban decreases violent crime, right? That has and the impact is, gun violence, violent crime from gun violence is high, right? That's your terminal impact. A link turn simply says, no, a handgun ban increases violence, and handgun violence is bad, right? You've conceded their terminal impact, that handgun violence is bad, but you've turned their link, that a ban would decrease violence, instead said that it would increase violence. Does that make sense? What would happen if, this is probably never going to happen, but what would it be if I said handgun ban increases violence and gun violence is good? What is that called? That's a double turn. Just wanted to make sure we're on the same page. So either going for a link turn strategy or an impact strategy. Well, let me talk about this I'll talk about impact turns and internal link turns in a second. But the point is, you either have to focus on the link, the internal link, or the impact, but not multiple of them, because then you end up double turning yourself. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. The link turns are usually the best and most efficient way to destroy a case, since you can concede so much of that link story and not worry with weighing your impact or internal links, because you have conceded their impact. You said, yeah, your impact is right, but I'm going to access that impact, right? And so it's also just the most direct way to address their position. If you win a link turn, you win exclusive access to the terminal impact. The link turn prevents your opponent from accessing the terminal impact, right? And there are a lot of different potential argument structures for how a link turn could work. So for example, you could say if they say neg causes Y to happen, you say neg prevents Y from happening, right? Y being something bad. If they say the AF causes Y, you can say the AF prevents Y. If they say AF decreases Y, you say AF increases Y, right? You can go on and on with these different combinations, but the point is, they say increase, you say decrease. If they say causes, you say prevents. If they say prevents, you say causes, right? Those are all examples of ways that you can articulate your link terms. Any questions on link terms? Yes?
So say someone in their card about handgun violence, if we were to have a handgun ban, we would decrease violence by 25%. But then you also have another statistic that says, well, if we have a handgun ban, like there was a handgun ban in this specific area and it increased violence, how do you gain offense since they're both just like evidence cards that say different?
That is a great question. So this is where evidence comparison comes into play. Evidence comparison is critical to being a good offensive debater because otherwise you get into situations just like, what's your name?
Samuel.
What's that?
Samuel.
Samuel. You get into situations just like Samuel described. Who's heard the phrase "two ships passing in the night"? Anybody heard that phrase? People at debate used to use it a lot more frequently. What does that phrase mean?
That basically means you're not generating offense.
Yeah, I mean, it just means like person A is talking about something and person B is talking about something, and they're both disagreeing, but there's never any clash, right? It's just like, nah, I'm right, nah, I'm right, nah, I'm right, nah, I'm right. So the way that we resolve that situation where your opponent has a piece of evidence that says the exact opposite of what your piece of evidence says is through evidence comparison. There's a few routes that you go about this, and there's going to be an entire elective given on evidence comparison that like I could go on and on about, but I'll go ahead and give the basic details in this lecture. Know the methodologies of your statistical studies. What is a methodology? Yeah.
Like how it works and like how, like say it was like a study, like how that was conducted or something.
Precisely, how the study was conducted, right? When I was debating, I used what we called a cheat sheet for our statistical studies, our empirical evidence. These cheat sheets included the most important details of that study's methodology, so that if anybody asked about those details, we had them on a document that we could just pull up and be like, yeah. It would include details like the control variables in the study. Who knows what a control variable is? Yeah.
The variable that's like not changed during the experiment.
Right. So what is the point of having controlling for variables in studies?
So you can compare the impacts from like the other not controlled variables.
Correct, exactly. So, excuse me. So in a study about handgun violence, what might be some of the control variables that people would have in their studies? What are other things that would influence handgun violence besides bans? Think about it.
Like
So
if you have a criminal record, well,
Think about it like on a policy, either a political or a cultural level. If you have a study and they're trying to say that handgun bans decrease violence, what control variables are they going to have to consider in order to prove that it was actually the handgun ban that decreased violence and not something else? How about, oh, go ahead.
so say someone has a study on a handgun ban violence in a certain country and it lowered the crime rate, but really that country actually just has a ban on all guns.
Right, exactly. So they might have a different kind of ban, right? So they would consider that. Or maybe the places where the study was conducted have they have a lot higher funding for the police. They have a lot more police on the streets, right? Maybe that could influence handgun violence. Or the places in question have they have loopholes in the laws, like we have with the gun shows and things like that, right? That the gun ban wouldn't take into account right away. Or gun regulations, right? So there's just other control variables that might influence the rate of gun violence that have to be considered by the people creating these studies in order to isolate causation versus correlation. Who's heard that that phrase, correlation versus causation? Good.
I mean, I don't really know what it means, but I've heard it.
Okay, so correlation means that two things are related, right? We know that there is some relationship between X and Y. causation actually proves that X causes Y. Right? So an example of correlation is that, so let's say, and it is summertime. Correlation would say, it is hot outside, therefore more people are going to come in and eat our ice cream, right? But we want to try to prove causation, right? Which is able to isolate all of the other variables to prove that the reason why people are coming inside to eat our ice cream is because it's hot outside, right? So we conduct studies. We ask customers to come in. Why have you come into our store today? Their answer is, because it's hot outside and I want ice cream, right? And through that, we've created a study that says, we've asked a lot of our customers why they've come in today. They've concluded that it's because it's hot outside and they want ice cream, and therefore we've proven causation, right? You're able to isolate the other variables by directly asking the customer, right? But oftentimes in these studies, we don't get that direct, it's not that easy, right? Especially in terms of something like handgun violence. So we have to control for these other variables in order to prove causation, that there is a direct causal relationship between handgun bans and decreasing violence, or handgun bans and increasing violence. And your entire point of evidence comparison on those particular debates is to prove that that causal relationship exists, and that it's not something else that's causing a decrease or increase in violence. Is that clear? Okay. And to finish this point on evidence comparison, you can compare your author's credentials, you can compare the recency of the evidence when it was created, you can compare methodologies of the study, and you can do in-depth comparison of the warrants in the study to explain why the warrants in your piece of evidence come prior to your opponent's piece of evidence. You can compare analytical versus empirical warrants. Again, I can go on and on about evidence comparison, and there will be a separate lecture for that. But to answer your question, evidence comparison and getting good at it is how you resolve that situation. Any questions on that? Okay, cool, doing pretty good on time. So the next thing that I'll talk about are internal link turns. So internal link turns apply when there is an actual link chain. There's actually a series of steps that lead to the terminal impact. This is most often seen in disads, also exists in ACs. But turning the internal link, like I said earlier, is just isolating one of the middle links in a particular link chain and saying that that side works for you. Again, if you win access to an internal link turn, you win exclusive access to the terminal impact, just like a link turn. The internal link turn prevents your opponent from accessing their terminal impact, but you must weigh the internal links against each other. So what that means is, say, okay, so this is a pretty good example. So a few years ago, there was a topic about decriminalizing drugs. The argument was that the abuse of illegal drugs ought to be treated as a matter of public health, not of criminal justice. And negatives on that topic were reading a politics dissent. I don't want to take the time to go all in on politics, but long story short, the dissent said that if we decriminalize drugs, that a key nuclear arms reduction treaty between the US and Russia was not going to pass in the legislature. And that treaty passing was key to staving off US-Russian nuclear war, right? So the link in that scenario is that decriminalizing drugs prevents the treaty from passing, right? The internal link was that the treaty is going to prevent US-Russian nuclear war. Our strategy by the end of that topic was to go for internal link turns against this dissent, to say that no, the START Treaty is not going to prevent US-Russian nuclear war. In fact, the START Treaty is what is going to cause the US-Russian nuclear war from happening, right? And we have lots of pieces of evidence that said that, right? So we're not turning the link. We're not saying the START Treaty, will pass in the app world. We're conceding that it won't pass. But we are saying that it would be a bad thing if it passed, right? We are turning the internal link of that argument. If I had markers, I would try to write this on the board to help you visualize it, but unfortunately I don't have any markers. does everyone kind of understand that, get the idea of how an internal link turn works? Okay. And then the last type of turn is an impact turn. So impact turns can potentially be strategic if you're not prepared on the link or internal link debate. And the counterintuitive nature of impact turns will oftentimes put your opponent on their heels. But at the same time, the impact turn can also be very harmful in that if you're in front of the wrong judge, it can come across as very unpersuasive. Also, oftentimes the cards that you read for impact turns are not very good, just because the arguments are very counterintuitive and frankly often not true. So examples of impact turns would be Malthus, right? Who knows what Malthus's argument is? Yeah.
And food production cannot like equal the rate of human population growth, so then it's like basically everyone's kind of starved.
Right. So I literally haven't heard this argument in like 7 years, but as an example, people would say like, well, this is true, and therefore things like genocide are good, things like limited or like isolated nuclear attacks, those are good because it kills off some of the population and staves off, or like turns the tide of that overconsumption, right? Other impact turns, like I've said, global warming staves off the ice age. I've heard domestic terrorism is good because it boosts the economy, right? So oftentimes these arguments are very counterintuitive, bordering on offensive potentially, but they will certainly put your opponent on their heels if they're not expecting it. Quick story. So when I was debating a debater from Greenhill, and we were at some national tournament, and I was going to break this new disadvantage that I had written. It was a terrorism disadvantage. But I didn't think that they would have answers to the link level. And impact turns, people didn't make them that frequently. I just wasn't expecting that strategy. I didn't really see it coming. So I get in there and I debate, and this 1AC that he read was a new 1AC, but the terrorism just had still linked, but it was a new 1AC that I didn't really understand too well. So I took a lot of my prep time after the NC. I had like maybe 20 seconds left after, before I gave my next speech, which, side note, never ever leave yourself 20 seconds of prep time left before your last speech. Like, it's a horrible idea. You should always leave yourself with at least like a minute of prep time before your last speech to avoid situations like this. So I leave myself with 20 seconds of prep time. I give my NC. I think it's a pretty good speech. Then he stands up in the 1AR with no prep time. I sit down for my speech and he stands right back up. I'm like, uh-oh, something's going on here. And he starts his timer and he reads 4 minutes of impact turns. He concedes utility, concedes my framework, and reads 4 minutes of impact turns against terrorism. Terrorism good. And he's got just tons of cards. And I'm trying to like write answers as we're going, but I can't keep up. He's reading them fast and he's got maybe 20 of them. And I got 20 seconds of prep left by the time he sits down. Long story short, he caught me completely off guard. I wasn't expecting these arguments like U.S. domestic terrorism is good because it increases U.S.-Brazilian relations, and that's key to something else I don't even remember. There's arguments about the economy, there's all sorts of stuff, right? But there weren't very good arguments. The cards were terrible, but I was caught so off guard by them that I just ended up getting hosed. I gave a horrible rebuttal, ended up losing that debate with pretty poor speaks. So I say this story, I tell this story to say a few things. One is don't save yourself 20 seconds of prep time before your last speech so you don't get caught, backtracking. And B, impact turns can be a very viable strategy if you think that your opponent is not going to be expecting it. And you think the judge is going to be okay with it. Any questions on impact turns? Can we do an impact turn and a link turn?
No.
No. Can we do an impact turn and an internal link turn? No. Can we do a link turn and an internal link turn? No. You gotta pick one, or else you're gonna double turn yourself. Okay? Pick either what part of the link they're weakest, whether it's the link, the internal link, or the impact, / what you have the best evidence on, whether it's the link, internal link, and impact, and then invest entirely on that. Skip that. Okay, so I'll conclude with this, and this is tips that you can do outside of this lecture to help you get better at generating offense, since we only have 3 minutes left. So first tip here is for drills. Force yourself in your practice rounds to make 60 to 75% of your arguments offensive. There's a good drill that we use sometimes that's called the all offense drill, and it's hard, but you have to try to come up with as many offensive arguments as you possibly can, and go an entire round only making offensive arguments. Force yourself to do that for the sake of practice, and it's hard. You still may end up losing that practice debate, but the whole idea is to get you in an offensive mindset, right? Like, how do I think about arguments offensively? So the whole time while you're sitting there prepping for your practice debate, you're being forced to think about offensive arguments and how you can make offensive arguments, right? And these arguments might not be good, but the whole point is getting you in the mindset of thinking offensively so that when you're in an actual round, you can make 60 to 75% of your arguments offensive, right? So trying to do things like all offense drills in your practice rounds or outside of rounds to get in the offensive mindset. Second tip would be try kicking your standard, accepting their standard, and generating offense solely under their standard for your entire speech time in your practice rounds, right? So if an opportunity comes up to try that, you should. Concede their standard, concede their framework, and generate offense under their framework. And that way you dodge the framework debate altogether. You don't have to deal with that. You can invest all of your time in making offensive arguments that you can win off of, as opposed to framework debates that you can't win off of. Okay, so try practicing that. And the last thing that you can try to do outside of this lecture is to sit down and diagram major link stories. So when your opponent has a lengthy link chain in their argument, in their disad, their AC, whatever, try diagramming that. If I had a marker, but the way you would diagram that is by literally drawing a link chain, right? A series of circles that are linked together. And then you can visualize what those distinct links are. And then you can cut evidence back and forth on every potential link, internal link, and impact debate, right? So as more arguments are being made on the topic, as you see what the common disads are, what the common link chains are in AFs, etc., diagram those link chains, isolate the link, internal link, impact, then go cut cards against each one of those things. So that way you have multiple options for when that time comes. So this is less of a drill and more of like a how do you research to generate offense, right? Who knows what the disclosure wiki? People, are y'all familiar with the disclosure wiki? Okay. So I won't talk about it a lot in here, but you should ask your lab leaders about it. They will know what it is. Ask your lab leaders about the disclosure wiki. The long story short is it's where a lot of the top debaters in the country post outlines and citations of the cases that they've read at tournaments, right? The disclosure wiki is super helpful for seeing what trends are becoming popular, so that way you can see what arguments your opponents are making, diagram link chains as such, or just like see what their argument is, and that way you can go and cut evidence to their link story, to their internal link story, to their impact story. And if you do that for a lot of the top debaters in the country, you're gonna have a pretty hefty topic file that you can take with you to your next tournament, right? So tying it back all the way to the beginning, good research, extensive research, in-depth research, all key to being a good offensive debater. So in conclusion, don't be lazy, research, cut cards, cut good cards, read a lot about the topic. Don't be too framework heavy, and don't be afraid to accept your opponent's standard. Be specific, be precise, and be aggressive. Don't hold back. Try to generate as many offensive arguments as you possibly can, but also be precise and specific and generate in-depth warrants. Again, it's better to have fewer in-depth turns than to have a lot of blippy defensive arguments. And lastly, commit to offense, because offense is what is going to win you the debate rounds, and you will certainly win more debates than if you take defensive heavy strategy approaches instead. Any questions? Okay, go to lab.
Thank you.
Thank you.